People's opinions on the Netflix Avatar are mixed.
I like to play airball and eat banana cakes and goof off with my friends.
That's fine. That doesn't mean you're an idiot if you love it, and it doesn't mean you're some bitter old cynic who's never pleased by anything if you despise it. It most likely means that the show itself is a mixed bag of good and bad things that people are noticing to different degrees. In my opinion, it's a fun, pretty cheesy show made with a lot of obvious love, making some interesting changes that often are quite good, actually, only there's serious problems with the writing, especially the structure and the dialogue that do undermine most of the good stuff. You know, the internet has a tendency to lose its mind when a show does something bad and to then judge it all as trash, and the writers are the dumbest people to ever exist. But if you look a little closer, I think there is genuine potential in this show, and that's kind of what's frustrating because it's so close to being good. You don't actually have to change much to turn episode 1, in this case, from what I think is a 3 or a 4 out of 10. In my opinion, it's the worst episode of the whole season, but it doesn't actually take that much to turn it instead into something genuinely compelling, so that's what we're going to attempt today. Half a review of episode 1 and half an exploration of what it would take to make this as good as it deserves to be, and if we're lucky, maybe we'll learn something about writing for ourselves. I don't know, it's hard for me to say until we get going. Starting with a train. If episode 1 is the worst in this season, and that is just my opinion, but we also have to recognise it might be the hardest episode to write because there is so much to establish. It's easy to forget how alien the Four Nations, bending, the 100 Years War, the Avatar, the cycle of the Avatar state, obviously who all the main characters are. It's easy to forget just how much needs conveying here if you're familiar with the original show. Oh, and also how you get Oppa to fly. It seems they cut Yip Yip from this show. I understand that, so I'm not at all hurt. Look, there's the challenge of conveying all of that, setting up the whole season, and of really hooking people into this show with a bang. Like, this is a big, expensive live action adaptation. Rightly or wrongly, I think that does come with some kind of pressure and expectation to kick this off with something quite epic in scale, you know? Seeing Fire Lord Sozin's war crimes at the Southern Air Temple makes a lot of sense then. Without that, you have an opening episode where most of the conflict and the action is set in Wolf Cove, where there's barely anyone, mostly kids and old people, and Zuko only has a handful of soldiers. For the original cartoon, that's a perfect first setting for this story about kids.
Well, you're just a teenager.
For a live action adaptation that wants to set itself apart through drama and be a bit more realistic and dark in places, I can understand why they might want to kick this off with something more. And equally in that vein, we kick this whole show off with an action scene, a chase between Fire Nation guards and an Earth Kingdom spy that I quite like. It's a pretty decent way to showcase what bending is. Okay, you've got some people doing some martial arts move and it can make the earth do stuff or fire appear. Okay, that makes sense. They steal a scroll, but one of them is captured and taken to Fire Lord Sozin, where we learn, twist, Sozin wanted them to steal the scroll, to tell the other 3 nations that the Fire Nation is planning to attack the Earth Kingdom, because then it's a clever ruse. They will instead attack the air nomads. You know, I'm not sold on the dialogue here. I don't think I'm sold on any of the dialogue from this show. In this example, I think they spell out the point with zero subtlety, make it absolutely obvious what this ruse is. Also, for Sozin to be explaining this at all to some random bloke, I think we'd need more of his personality or some more motivation for him to explain this. However, what this scene does is show us that we have a really solid basic structure to this episode. Let's look at it. The start point is Sozin preparing to attack the air nomads, and the end point is Aang going to the southern air temples and discovering what happened to all of his people in this attack. That's quite a clear structure that you can actually do a lot with. Plus, you don't even need to sit down and explain the 100 Years' War, because we get to see it beginning. We get to learn via the experience of it happening. There's this guy called Sozin and he started a war. Even better, we go from this scene with Sozin preparing to invade to then Aang in the air temples. We see Aang living a peaceful, happy life. We see how wonderful it is there, whilst we as the audience know it's going to be invaded soon. Things are going to go wrong. That is just a great tension to let simmer under the surface while we learn about our main character. That's really good. Let that simmer, let the suspense slowly rise until boom! You've got the big action set piece they'll have wanted to fit into episode 1, this invasion. And then afterwards you've got Aang freed from the ice, slowly figuring out where he is now, what's happened to the world without the Avatar around. Then all of that slowly building up and reaching a climax as he discovers Gyatso's body and what Sozin did. That's the big impactful moment right before the end, and then we finish with the decision, okay, I need to do something about this war. I'm going to master the 4 elements and I'm going to give Mr. Ozai a biff on the nose. That works, you know? That's a good structure, that should work. Why doesn't it work? Well, let's get back to the beginning and go through it a bit more clearly. I think firstly we need to change 2 things in this scene. One is don't explain Sozin wants to attack in order to kill the Avatar. Don't make that motivation clear. Raise it as a question within the scene. Let it be something for us to think about, you know. Why attack the air nomads first when they're not the threat? Why not invade the Earth Kingdom? Perhaps if I watch on I will find out the answer to this. Sozin could hint why, but don't explain it. Just have him preparing to invade and then cut to Aang. And point 2 for this scene is just make the dialogue more natural, but I could say that for every scene, and also like, just me saying that make it better is a really wishy-washy thing. I think we'd either have to in-depth go through all of the lines I would change and give my personal examples of what I might do, but we'd be here all day. That'd be getting bogged down in something that isn't the focus here. We're looking at the bigger picture. So we change that anyway. Make Sozin's motivation for killing the Avatar not so clear. Have it something we and Aang kind of discover together much later in the episode. Perhaps after finding Gyatso's body, that's where Aang realises, okay, they killed all of these people because they were trying to get me. Then the guilt of that can really hit him and be really impactful. But also, super importantly, this Sozin scene doesn't actually go straight to Aang. Instead, we get a scene in the middle which is a bit like the budget version of the opening monologue from the original show. Parts of it literally explain again what this scene with Sozin has already made painfully clear to us. It's unnecessary, but I think rhythm-wise we need to cut from Sozin's talk about invading the air temples with some very vague hint about killing the Avatar to a shot of Aang. I think that needs to come directly next. I think the contrast it creates is important to the tension and to the sense of, oh no, this is the place the Fire Nation is about to invade. Okay, fine. This little monologue bit does explain some useful exposition that we might need. The audience does need to understand the 4 elements and the 4 nations and what the Avatar is, but you've done some of that already in scenes, so do the rest within scenes as well. And to be clear, yeah, I know the original show did it with a prologue, but that was literally the first thing in the cartoon. I think we've moved past that point here already. Plus, you could kind of get away with it in 20-minute episodes of a kids' cartoon that made that into their opening credits, where I'm not sure that works so well in a more dramatic, more episodic live-action format. And thirdly, it breaks up the rhythm this story is attempting to build through its structure, so I just think cut it and work things in scene. Like, off the top of my head, I can imagine this Southern Air Temple section beginning with, like, a teacher in the Air Temple. She's explaining this stuff to some really young airbenders, and they're a bit bored because it's obvious to them. They're instead jumping in with a more exciting question, interrupting each other, jumping up at their teacher to ask who is the next Avatar. Have they appeared yet? Do you know? It has to be an airbender because they go next in the cycle, right? And then, while this is happening, I don't know, have Aang burst through the middle of this on an airball, accidentally accidentally knocking stuff over, laughing, playing part of a fun game that we then move to follow happening. He's playing airball with his friends, let's enjoy that for a quick moment, you know? I suspect there are better ways of conveying that information than my suggestion there, but you can do this stuff so easily within a scene that is also conveying character and establishing this nice peaceful home in the air temples that we know is going to be attacked. Whether or not my example is right, you can see how this kind of thing could be better. Anyway, here's the next change. We need a scene of Aang having fun as a simple kid. In my version, we see him burst through on an airball and then we follow him to see him not just having fun but being clearly much more talented than all the other kids at this. Oh, that's interesting. So we've just heard the next avatar would be an airbender and this kid here seems to be very talented. I wonder. I think most people are aware about this version of the show that it does a bit too much tell and not show with their dialogue and their exposition and things, and I think this first really important aspect of our main character needs to be made absolutely clear to us. He is a goofy kid who likes to have fun and isn't really bogged down in ideas of duty. Going back to the drawing board, that's again the basic structure we get this episode. That's its general arc. Aang starts as someone who is shirking responsibility, then he discovers what happens to the world when the Avatar doesn't stand up and fight, therefore he finishes ready to accept his responsibility as the Avatar. That's again a good basic structure that we can do a lot with here. Anyway, the show then has a scene with Gyatso, and I want to say I really like Lim Kay-Siew as Gyatso. I think he excels despite often flawed dialogue, and that's a testament to his performance here. Also, he's got a great voice, and I quite like his dynamic with Aang. Whilst the content of their discussion is pretty bad in my opinion, I think the chemistry and the setup works. You can feel something here. I also like the idea of everybody coming for this Comet Festival and Aang being excited about that. I think that's a good touch and it's a good reason for why all of the airbenders are in one easy place for an attack. But I don't think this guy popping up depressed that Aang needs to be told he's the Avatar. Then a scene where they discuss Aang being the Avatar, followed by a scene where Aang is told he's the Avatar. I think those 3 beats need reworking, because otherwise it's just the audience knowing something from the beginning, getting bored waiting for Aang to know it as well, but also without much investment in Aang. Not enough sense of who he is so that we're worried or excited or intrigued about how he's going to take this news. I also think this whole conflict within Gyatso of whether to tell Aang or whether to kind of shield him from it until he's older, that needs to be a stronger conflict. Without it, these are just 3 scenes of Aang learning he's the Avatar that don't actually feel like story. There isn't actually much development within them. So I think you build more initial intrigue. We've already done that. We've vaguely hinted he's the... B. Establish Aang isn't someone for responsibility. Establish that before we learn he's the Avatar, because now when he does learn, we have a decent idea of how he's going to react. We can connect to his emotion. Plus, it massively emphasizes the important conflict here. Aang doesn't like responsibility. Here he is being given the greatest responsibility of all. That needs to be a big punch, you know? And C, yeah, make Gyatso's own conflict more clear. He's supposed to tell Aang he's the Avatar because he needs to begin his training, but he also feels Aang needs to have a childhood, otherwise this could be damaging to the kind of human Aang will grow into. In the show, he doesn't tell Aang, then the council says he has to tell Aang despite him suggesting it would be bad, so he tells Aang. That doesn't feel like much of a back and forth conflict within himself reaching a resolution, you know? So if we do all that, my own example version for how it could look, but again this is just me providing an example, I expect there's a lot better ways to do this, but we go from Aang playing airball with his friends and being great at it, to this guy very sternly telling Aang off in particular. Why Aang especially? He makes some comment about needing to be responsible, and that feels a bit weird. Aang is visibly confused by it. Why is he talking so much about responsibility to me? But the guy walks off and Aang sees Gyatso, so he vents to him like a father figure to confide in. feeling. He can say, like, I don't know, about feeling like people always put more pressure on him especially. Or he can complain about that other monk being too strict and too serious. He's always talking about responsibility, but I'm only 12. And anyway, you've always said it's important to nurture a playful side, Gyatso. This isn't example dialogue, that's just me summarising the kind of things they could discuss. But it moves the conversation to a point where you feel Gyatso is about to say something big, but then he doesn't. And Aang goes off to play or to feed Appa or something, and you end the scene on a close-up of Gyatso looking troubled. What was this thing he was about to say but didn't? Gyatso can then take this troubled feeling into the scene at the council. He's the one wanting to go and see them because he wants to suggest it's too early to tell Aang yet. Gyatso gets to be a lot more active if he's the one bringing forward this case, and then the council can tell him no, that either Gyatso tells Aang or someone else will, so Gyatso agrees because it's best to come from him. He says Aang needs to be told gently, otherwise he might react badly. That Aang may be very talented, but he is still a kid at heart. He won't like the idea of leaving home. So hopefully you can see how narrative develops much clearer between those scenes. It's not just plot, it's a conflict plus a growing sense of how Aang is going to react when he learns the truth. This is all just about tightening the structure of the scenes and making sure there is a consistent story throughout. I suppose you could even go into this next scene with Gyatso slightly nervous to tell Aang, or Aang at first saying things that suggest he's 100% not the kind of person who wants to take on a massive burden, and that can make Gyatso even more unsure about how to tell him. Or to be honest, I love the way the original show did it. I know we shouldn't compare too much, but Aang overhears this conversation and in one clear shot you understand exactly what he feels. Not just because the emotion on his face makes it clear, but because everything we've already seen and been set up to understand about Aang means we intuitively get what he would feel in this moment. You could so easily do that here too. You could even make a fun scene of Aang mischievously wanting to eavesdrop on this council, thinking it's a conversation about the Comet Festival, wanting to learn some of the information about that, and then boom, they're talking about him being the Avatar. The scene with Gyatso is so long though. Then there's a long monologue with Aang talking to Appa. Not only is it bad dialogue, but the length and the slowness of that pace lessens the sense of Aang acting impulsively. And in general, Aang just seems to leave here because apparently Aang needs to go somewhere vague where things make more sense. That's what he says, so him and Appa fly off and get lost in a storm. It's not clear enough. It softens Aang's motivations, reduces the sense of him running away out of fear, which means there's then less clearly emphasized reason in the story for him to feel guilt about not being there when the Fire Nation invades. And that then means there's less character to explore there later in the story. That is a bit of a problem. So I'd just make it a little bit more obvious Aang is acting out of fear, have him more impulsively run away, get to that happening much quicker. So yeah, that was quite a lengthy explanation of things that need tweaking in this first section of the episode. I won't need to do that quite as much with the next bits, but hopefully it's highlighting how easily slight problems could be fixed, because tightening the structure resolves a lot of that, and actually I think the biggest, most important fix for the entire episode can be done without really having to change many scenes or dialogue at all. That's the thing I want to discuss next.
Monks don't even trust me to feed the baby bison, and I'm supposed to save
51% on a subscription to World Anvil. Yep, they sponsored this video, they're still here, hopefully they'll stay here. World Anvil is an online tool for building worlds, creating characters, designing and managing campaigns for a whole slew of games. Sleuth isn't the right word, I don't know why I said that. Look, you can do all that, you can plan and write stories, you can do all sorts of different stuff for creative projects. I use it for the world building of my novel because my old system of massive Word documents became far too chaotic. Not only does the ability to create timelines with hyperlinks branching off to specific characters or articles or a billion other things, not only does that make it so much easier to quickly find the information I need, it also makes it so much easier to plan things out and kind of keep going. Sometimes a blank Word document for world building is very daunting, so having all sorts of tools to help with visualization, to help you figure out what needs planning next, to keep your brain fizzing and unimpeded, because all of the tools are very straightforward and easy to use, that's really important to me. It's like the sharper an artist's pencils, the freer they are to focus on the art. World Anvil is a very sharp pencil. You can create mind maps, you can rearrange elements of your story, do all sorts of campaign related things for that sleuth of games I mentioned. Yes, link in the description and as a pinned comment should you desire a 51% discount on all their subscriptions, or if you're not yet sure, then try out the free version for as long as you like. That's what I did at first, and now look where I am, shouting their name at you through a screen. World Anvil! I'm not actually sure we should see so much of the invasion. You know, saying that surprises me. I thought it was going to be a great moment. I was expecting Sozin to be blasting through people like Vader at the end of Rogue One. That would be amazing. I think what we get, to be fair, is good. I like this scene in isolation. The show sets up that it was coming, then we had bright airy scenes with Aang, now it's dark again, the temples are under attack, and I think it is quite well filmed. Structure-wise though, we now know exactly what happens to all of Aang's people. Especially Gyatso, we see him burned alive, we know all of this. So there's now no question in our minds, no vague hope or tension about what happened. Nothing to sit in the back of our minds whilst Aang goes through Wolf Cove on the gradual return to the air temples, and boom, then finds Gyatso's body. You know, I think us already knowing this lessens the weight of that reveal at the end. Remember, that's our structure here. Everything is building to Aang discovering Gyatso's body. That's the climax of this episode. You've got to do everything you can in the script to make that moment land as much as possible. So just don't show us Gyatso dying. Leave it more ambiguous. We can have the sense he probably is going to die, the understanding that's what's likely to happen, but also offer a faint, cruel little morsel of hope where, like, Gyatso has some vague plan or something for how to get people to escape. He's working on something, there's a minor chance, and then, I don't know, it ends with Sozin entering the room and Gyatso closing his eyes, taking a breath, preparing himself to fight. We don't see what happens, cut from that to Katara. I think that makes it easier to align ourselves with Aang. As a side note, by the way, some people have mixed views on the firebenders burning people alive, whether the tone of that is wrong for this show. Personally, I like it. That's one of the changes I really enjoyed. Well, not enjoyed, you don't enjoy people burning alive, but I think it's a great way to make us fear them. I'm a bit sad in general that Sozin on the night of the comet wasn't more of a force, but touches like this do help add to that sense of villainy and that sense of incredible, dreadful power. I just think they do have to be a little bit careful about where and how they use this burning alive stuff. But anyway, we then cut to Katara, who has a pretty solid introduction, I think. This show is at its best in the moments where nobody is talking. Wolf Cove looks immense. I love it. Kids are doing things in the background. There's noise. Sometimes this show is a bit too caught up on close-ups that stop us from seeing the scenery around, but not here. Most of this stuff is fine. I could nitpick, you know? I'm sure you will do in the comments. The dialogue is never brilliant, but it's mostly fine, and we get a decent sense of sibling dynamic between Sokka and Katara. Moments like Katara breaking Aang out of the ice by trying to bend their boats aren't as impactful as in the original show, where it's her anger at Sokka that accidentally breaks the ice. Yes, I'd want more of that here for the sake of Katara's character, but we don't need to hold up the video discussing these scenes in depth. I think they're good enough. They discover Aang, they free him from the ice, and as far as I can think, there's two general ways for the show to play this. One is mystery. We, as the audience, getting to think, oh wait, that's the kid who we just saw flying away on Oppa. How the hell did he end up here? Let that be an interesting, genuinely creative bit of intrigue that we slowly then discover, oh bloody hell, he got trapped in the ice and was stuck there for 100 years and he doesn't even know what's happened while he was out. That's one option. Two, we know exactly how he ended up in there, and we know exactly how much time has passed. But not just knowing these things, really emphasizing them. As Aang falls into the ocean and enters the Avatar state, as Sozin burns the temples, we could then have some kind of clever montage of Aang freezing himself into the ice while time is passing around him. The Fire Nation conquering more and more places, war causing more suffering. You could even even just very basically see their territory expanding on a map. Showcase Aang being stuck there whilst we see all the bad things that are happening without him around. Bad things he might later blame himself for as though they were his responsibility. That's the other way to play this. We know all of it, the emotion of it has been made super clear to us. Our sense of intrigue is then, oh crikey, this kid doesn't realise how much time has passed or what has happened. How the hell is he going to feel when he finds out? And so then, in both of those options, Aang slowly discovers more and more clues until he sees Gyatso and boom, there's our climax. So the problem is the show kind of hovers between both of those options without fully committing to either. Well, no, I think the main problem is that the show doesn't build up a clearly developing arc towards the big reveal. Aang has like one very quick moment after waking up in the Southern Water Tribe to kind of think, where am I? This is weird, before he's then brought into a hall and Gran explains literally everything to him.
Water, earth, fire.
Don't do the prologue thing, you've already done the prologue thing! Telling him all about the war, what happened to his people, that it's 100 years in the future. That inevitably again softens the impact of this big reveal. Now he pretty much already knows that anyway, and he already has a much earlier beat to be sad about it in the story.
100 years. All my friends? Everyone I know?
You know, I can get why they do this, because realistically Gran would know this stuff. And realistically, why wouldn't she explain it all to him? And also the original show does kinda do this too.
No one has seen an airbender in 100 years. We thought they were extinct.
Extinct? What war? What are you talking about?
You're kidding, right?
Penguin!
Critically, Aang doesn't believe her. Well, not entirely. If you must insist on having Gran provide exposition on everything to him, which isn't essential, there are other workarounds, but even if that's the case, have Aang be in a state of denial about it. Gran is wrong, it can't have been 100 years. Even if there was an invasion, they wouldn't all be dead. The airbenders know how to fight. My old master Gyatso, he was incredible, he would know what to do. It's fine, there might just be a misunderstanding because we're way out at the southern pole. I'll see my people again soon. Let's not dwell on the worry, let's distract ourselves with penguin sledding, or some alternative that's less cruel to animals. Pepper in other little clues along the way. Okay, there's a Fire Nation ship heading towards us. There clearly is a war then. Something or rather could potentially be hinted by Zuko or Iroh, but Aang doesn't want to face any of this until Gyatso. Now's the moment he has to face it. Save it all up for this moment. It would take so few tweaks to tighten this stuff up, and not only would that make the story unravel in a much more compelling way, but the scene where he discovers Gyatso would be so much more impactful. And the other key change that I already talked about in the first section of this video is better emphasizing Aang shirking his responsibility, not wanting responsibility, being daunted by responsibility, wanting instead to avoid facing up to everything by focusing on fun. That's the main arc here, right? He doesn't want to be the Avatar. Then he learns all his people died and feels guilty as the Avatar for not being there. Therefore he decides he's going to fight the Fire Nation and save the world by fulfilling his duty as the Avatar. That conclusion only feels satisfying if the conflict was clear beforehand, so just a couple of tweaks. Change the scene where Aang is upset here after Gran tells him everything. Now Katara is coming out expecting to comfort someone sad, but Aang seems surprisingly upbeat. He says he disagrees. Gran must be wrong. He talks a little about Gyatso, and then he wants to do something fun, which eventually leads to this waterbending scene. You know, it's not like this stuff isn't in the show already, it just needs emphasizing a lot more to make this structure and this arc much clearer. One moment I already enjoy in the show is Sokka stepping out to fight Zuko one-on-one, and while they're fighting you get this shot of Aang through the town walls, looking horrified as he sees Sokka getting hurt. Sokka literally risking his life on Aang's behalf while Aang stays back not wanting to fight. That's good. I'd personally have a little bit more of it, like have Zuko kick Sokka here a couple of times when he's down, so that we can then have a second shot of Aang looking troubled. And then when Zuko is about to do to Sokka what Ozai did to him, which is a nice touch by the way, Aang instead comes running out pleading for him to stop. He'll go with them, just leave these people alone. Instead of that, the show goes for something kind of heroic, with Aang attacking and this dramatic pose, but I think that sort of undermines the arc of the episode. Kind of. This is a good moment of Aang wanting to avoid responsibility, but realising that doing that will cause others to be hurt. However, I think him heroically deciding to fight the Fire Nation makes more sense at the end, rather than half doing it now, half later. And again, if you want to say, well, in the original show he fought Zuko here, yes he did. However, Aang hits these character beats at different times because the structure is different for that show there. What they're going for here structure-wise I think is really good for a 1 hour episode, but they need to line things up clearly with that arc. And basically, I think if you tweak all those things I've suggested, which really does just come down to the structure and making sure that these arcs that are already in the story, those arcs and their beats are clearer and better emphasized within the script. I think doing that, you then have a really good spine. You know, to be honest, even if a lot of the dialogue remains quite cheesy, I think 90% of people would forgive that stuff if the story itself worked well. I mean, sure, I'd like better dialogue, I'd like costumes that look less clean, although I do understand the decision to make the colours pop and have the characters stand out, but yes, I'd like that. I'd like to do a bit more with Zuko and Iroh scenes. Generally though, I think fixing the spine to the episode would make it work well enough. And if I had to tweak anything else, fine, here's some quick extra points. I really liked the decision to have Iroh going for a conversation with Aang when they captured him. It's a really interesting change, and I personally like change in an adaptation. I don't want the original show, but in a live action form. I want the boldness to try new things within the story. So this idea, I think in concept, was really cool. What I don't like is how incredibly clear they make it that Iroh is going to turn against the Fire Nation later down the line.
Is that what you believe?
I must leave.
Similarly, Iroh hints early on that capturing the Avatar won't earn Zuko all the fatherly approval he's hoping for. I think just let us sit with who these characters seem to be now before you start hinting where they're heading later down the line. Both of Iroh's hints are painfully clear to the point you can kind of guess their entire character arcs across the next 3 seasons. I liked Aang offering Katara the advice to let go when bending the elements and how that helps Katara now. I do like when you can provide kind of philosophy or advice that feels tangible as a way for the magic stuff to work better. I think it's pretty good. Katara then dropping the water when she notices a Fire Nation ship in the distance, that's good. But can we either also have Aang try to learn something from her about waterbending, or have Katara want to travel with Aang so she can learn waterbending from a master? As it is, the episode never expresses why Katara or Sokka go with Aang beyond the vague plot reasons of it being dangerous to stay and them needing to help Aang. You know, some personal character reasons for them would be nice. In general though, for that to work, I think Katara and Sokka need to realise Aang is the Avatar earlier on. Aang discovering Gyatso was really rushed. Like, they land, they silently wander for about 10 seconds, then see Gyatso. There's no story beats here building up to that. I also don't like that Katara isn't talking Aang down from the Avatar state. I think it diminishes the sense of their importance to Aang, and it's just one of my favourite metaphors in the original show, and one of my favourite tropes in fiction in general. Like, my old supervisor used to always talk about that scene in whichever Hulk movie it was where he's raging. He's right up there in hyper-aroused fight response, and no amount of military power can threaten him enough to get him to step down. He's kind of beyond that. What it takes is Betty walking out to him with empathy, seeing him, reaching out for him. That's what brings him back down from this state. It's a super powerful, fitting metaphor. I really like it in the original Avatar show. I would like it here, but I suppose they kind of do have this happen in the final episode instead when he's being Godzilla, so fine. I don't like that after Aang cries for Gyatso and his people, in this concluding scene where Aang is kind of deciding to properly be the Avatar now, I don't like how much they try to put a bow on his grief. Like, really not wanting this episode to end on a sad moment, Katara providing some forced comfort about loss, then Aang saying something pretty basic in his Scrubs-esque voiceover.
The thing about losing everything is that that's when you learn how strong you really are.
Katara, literally everyone he ever lived with is dead. The whole world as he knew it is gone. We're talking about genocide of an entire people here.
It's only after we've lost something that we realize how much it means to us.
I just think it's fine to let the episode end with Aang feeling sad. You can conclude his arc for this episode without needing to wrap up all of his grief. Even in the cartoon that was aimed more directly at kids, even there they allowed the episode to end with Aang wistfully staring off after his home as it fades into the clouds. I could make other points, I could even pick apart every bad line of dialogue, but this is already too long a video, and why do that anyway? As it stands, I scored this episode a 3 or a 4 out of 10 in my notes when I first watched it. That is the lowest score I gave, and I think getting past this first episode, the story now officially on its way, I think it then becomes easier for the writers. They're also freer to change things up a lot more, which is good. I would have more positive things to say if I discussed episode 2 or 3 or any of the others. I mean, I suppose I didn't talk too much about the positives here actually anyway. Maybe you can have them in a pinned comment or something. Otherwise, let me know what you think of this video. Let me know if you want me to do the same thing for the next episodes in the show. Give it a like, subscribe, maybe even support me on Patreon, but otherwise, hopefully see you next time. And as ever, a special thank you goes to Grace, Luke Core, Treat You Caber, Michael Gallagher, Flying Spider, Kellyanne Davidson, Samara Salsi, Joshua C. Follier, and Chad Bramwell. Thank you.